I want to stress again how significant climate change is for us. There is no planet B. You know, we're here. This is it. And it's very important that we understand and begin to implement the policies that Diz is going to tell us about today. And to introduce Diz, I'd like to introduce Carol Parker, our Natural Resources Director. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. And thank you all for attending the event. Again, I wanted to say that we are going to have time for questions after the presentation, so please enter your questions into the Q&A. So I wanted to say first, talk about my road to understanding carbon pricing. And when I first proposed having a webinar on carbon pricing to our board, even through the computer screen of the Zoom meeting, I could see the blank stares. I guess there were more than a few members that didn't know how much about pricing carbon. And that was me too, just a couple of years ago. Previously, I felt I knew a fair amount about climate change. I had seen Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, in 2006. I understand on a simplistic level that if you take a lot of carbon that is found underground as coal, oil, or gas and burn it for fuel, you're going to end up with a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, where it heats up from the sun like in a greenhouse. I knew that it is scientific consensus that we need to lower our greenhouse gas emissions to basically zero in order to save our future. I understood that we as individuals can do our share to lower greenhouse gas emissions by using fuel efficient cars. I understood that installing solar panels was a good thing. I understood that we as a society needed to change our energy to renewable sources, but I didn't know how that would happen. About 2.5 to 3 years ago, I joined a climate change group that taught me how important pricing carbon is. This group is focused on a solution to fight climate change, to lobby Congress to pass a price on carbon. Their particular proposed legislation was expected to lower our country's greenhouse gas emissions within about 40% within 10 years. Considering that we need to lower 100% of greenhouse gas emissions within 30 years, this is a big deal. Pricing carbon was a revelation to me that the government could take a powerful step to fight climate change. And as this is a League of Women Voters webinar, I want to add that we as individuals can create political will with our legislators by letting them know in several ways that we want our government to take bold steps to really fight climate change with a price on carbon. We are extremely lucky to have just the person to teach us all about carbon pricing. Diz Swift is a member of the League of Women Voters of Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville, and wears many hats for League of Women Voters. She is the League of Women Voters California Climate Change Program Director and the League of Women Voters California Director of Natural Resources. She is also co-chair of the League of Women Voters US Climate Team and the chair of the League of Women Voters US Carbon Pricing Team. Dr. Swift was trained as a geologist and was formerly an executive with Chevron. She also runs the website priceoncarbon.org. I first met Diz a little over a year ago when she came in person, remember that? To San Diego to hold a seminar on climate change. Diz's words made a big impact on me, and I think you are all in for a treat today. Please welcome Diz Swift.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was a very nice introduction. I'm very flattered. So let me just show you some slides to get started. So carbon pricing and climate. There is no silver bullet for climate change. We do have silver buckshot. That was a quote from Scripps down in your neck of the woods. But carbon pricing, as one of my colleagues said, will give us a rocket fuel boost. And so it really does have a big effect. The League, as you know, has been strong on environment for a long time, but we have recently come to the fore with climate. This is from our website. As citizens of the world, we must protect our planet from physical, economic, and public health effects of climate change, while also providing pathways to economic prosperity. We've been involved in environmental so-called issues since the 60s, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, scores of letters, amicus briefs, lobbying, legal action, presentations, and so forth. Many, many actions. So this is not really foreign to us, but it has come now to the fore and has become part of the US program. In 2014, we formed the US team to advocate for carbon pricing. And in 2020, at the convention, not only did we get climate as part of program, but we declared a climate emergency. We formed the US climate team right after convention when it was declared part of program. And we have over 1,100 league members. Excuse me. The participation is shown by more intense colors where we have more members and less intense colors where we don't. We're in all but 7 states, so that's pretty darn good for just a startup. We have 11 national teams. One of them is federal legislation and policy, which is, I think, very important. Carbon pricing is the oldest of the teams, and we have a variety of other teams. If any of you is interested in joining, of course, you're all welcome. We also have the Price on Carbon website, which is priceoncarbon.org, very easy. It's endorsed by the US League. It has acts, you can see all of the carbon pricing legislation, all sorts of information on pricing mechanisms, revenue use, the science behind it, and a number of webinars, which I think are including summaries of the webinars. So Naomi Oreskes from Harvard, Adele Morris, who is an economist at Brookings, Bob Litterman, who was formerly risk management manager at Goldman Sachs and a partner, John Joya, who is a member of California Air Resources Board and the chief economist for CARB, and Nat Cohan, the vice president of Environmental Defense Fund, who has worked directly with China to establish their cap and trade program. So there's a lot of resources on this website, and all the things I talk about are available at some form on that website. Why do we need to work on this with urgency? These are the emissions. This is the Keeling curve from 1960 to present, showing increase in CO2 in the atmosphere as measured at Mauna Loa. We're well over 411 now. The most recent I saw was 414. And the problem is that where we want to be is around 350. In order to stay below the warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees, we need to get down. So we need to drop down. The problem is once CO2 is up in the atmosphere, it stays there for the order of 100 to 200 years. So in order to keep our temperatures from really going up, we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. The first legislative interview question that for those of you who are doing legislative interviews is on using California natural and working lands as a drawdown to do just this. So carbon pricing is a way to reduce emissions. And how do you price carbon? There are 3 principal elements in carbon pricing, and all are important. The pricing mechanism, and we'll talk about each, the emissions that are included, and how you use the revenue. In terms of pricing mechanism, there's essentially 2, a carbon tax, sometimes called a fee, they're essentially the same, and cap and trade. A carbon tax is fairly straightforward. You put a tax or a fee on all carbon use in terms of, for example, fossil fuel use, power plant use. If it's any kind of greenhouse gas can be priced with a tax. But how does cap and trade work? And let me take you to a wonderful presentation that actually explains this.
As the name suggests, the cap and trade system has 2 parts. The first part is the cap. The government sets a maximum amount of emissions. The second part is the trade. The government sells or issues permits to emitters of greenhouse gases. and every emitter needs a permit for every ton of GHGs that they emit. The trade part is that they can trade among themselves, and in that market for permits, a price is established. Facing that carbon price, everyone has an incentive to reduce emissions. Let's look at an example. Imagine two companies. Let's call them Company A and Company B. Based on the market price of carbon, Company A and B determine what investments they can make that will reduce their emissions at a lower cost than paying the carbon price. They then must ensure their permits equal their remaining emissions. Company A identified many low-cost opportunities to reduce emissions. As a result, it has more permits than it needs. Company B, on the other hand, mostly has expensive options for reducing GHG emissions. As a result, it wants to buy additional permits. Trading benefits both companies. A sells its excess permits to B. What is the overall impact on the economy? All companies take actions that make sense for them. Collectively, their decisions satisfy the cap, with the low-cost firms doing more emissions reductions and the high-cost firms doing less. The overall impact is that emissions get reduced at the lowest possible economic cost.
So thank you, Canada. Let's go back. So that's, oopsie, sorry.
Could taking a shot every day help you lose weight, support your heart health, soften
Oh
your
dear,
skin, and support your immune system?
Sorry about that. We'll get back to where we need to be. So carbon tax is relatively straightforward. Cap and trade is relatively straightforward too, and some would argue more straightforward, but I want to explain it to you so you understand. The second element is emissions included. And oops, let's go back here. Emissions included can be electricity generation, transportation, industrial buildings, and so forth, but you don't need to include all emissions. Some of the cap and trade systems are only on power generation, some are only on transportation, and so forth. This is a diagram of 2018 US carbon emissions. Transportation is the biggest, and it is mostly liquid petroleum fuels. So that's to produce gasoline and diesel. Electricity generation is still mostly coal, but moving up in natural gas. And just 2 years ago, these two were flipped. So electricity generation was larger than transportation. And then the other main elements are industrial, residential, and commercial, which are mostly buildings. The third element is revenue use. So that can be how the revenue is used and can be taken back by the government or kept by the government in a tax. It's given to the government in the cap and trade. It's the allowances that are sold by the government. So both generate revenue. And how that revenue is used, if it's kept by the government, can be to mitigate and adapt, can be reducing the deficit, can be infrastructure, can be K through 12, et cetera, and or it can be revenue neutral. In other words, the amount of money doesn't increase in the government doesn't keep it. It can be returned to the people as a dividend or in other ways, like to reduce other taxes. California has a cap and trade system, and it stays with the government for programs to mitigate and adapt. Van Hollen bill is called the Cap and Dividend Bill in Congress right now. And it's a cap and trade, but the revenue is returned as a dividend. British Columbia has a carbon tax, and its revenue is used to reduce other taxes. So it's revenue neutral also. Citizens Climate Lobby has what they call a fee, and a dividend is returned to the people. So there's lots of different ways to price carbon. This is a map of where carbon pricing is happening now. Existing cap and trade in green, you see California here, and huge in China. We'll talk a little more about that. Existing carbon tax and a combination of carbon tax and cap and trade. and places in yellow where carbon tax or carbon price, either cap and trade or carbon tax, is in consideration. The oldest is in Europe, but the most important right now is in China. They are by far the largest emitter, and they have put in a cap and trade system just recently. They started out in their mega cities, and now they've got it across the country. In the US, we have, here's California, we have a cap and trade system. Others, there's a different kind of cap and trade in Washington, some consideration of cap and trade and some consideration of carbon tax. Carbon tax has been tried in many times and has never passed anywhere, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. There's been for a while now in the Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic states something called RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's on only power plants. And recently they've added the Climate and Transportation Initiative, which is only on transportation. And both of these are cap and trade systems. And with RGGI, they've seen a dramatic decrease in emissions from power plants from this cap and trade system. So cap and trade has some track record in the US. Carbon tax is having a hard time getting off the ground. Does cap and trade work? Yep, it does. In the 80s, you remember acid rain? It was a health and environmental problem, mostly in the Northeastern US. And in 1990, it was decided that we put a cap and trade system in place applied to sulfur dioxide emissions, mostly from coal plants, but not exclusively. And this is where we were in 1990, cap and trade. By 2016, it was completely eliminated. It worked, and it worked fast. So you can see this is only 26 years, and actually it was pretty much nothing even earlier. So cap and trade works. This is the European Union, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, cap and trade systems. And this is from 2005 to nearly present, and the emissions are declining. One of the challenges in the European Union is there's some of the countries, but not all, also have a carbon tax, but not on the same things. So this is only on the European emissions that are monitored by cap and trade. And so it is decreasing. Now, allowance permit price is something important to understand about cap and trade. People will, this is from our little movie. And to explain, the price doesn't mean a whole lot in cap and trade. If you just monitor the price and say, oh, the price isn't going up, that doesn't mean anything. What it does mean is that there are cheaper ways to reduce emissions. So in this case, if company A can find a cheaper way to reduce emissions in their plant, retrofit or changing process or something, then they have two choices. They can trade, as said in the movie, with another company that needs more, or they don't buy emission allowances at all, permits. And so the price doesn't continue up because there's not as much demand. So the price, if it stays stable, that since the cap is declining, we know that we're reducing emissions, and the price going up simply means that there are cheaper ways to reduce those emissions than buying allowances. So the difference between cap and trade and carbon tax is just really fairly straightforward. The difference is where the government comes in. In cap and trade, a declining emissions cap is set by the government, and the price is based on the market, whether the company needs to buy allowances, and the trade also sets the price. In a carbon tax, a rising price tax is set by the government, and the emissions volume is based on the market. If it costs more money, they try not to find ways not to have to pay that additional money. So that's really all there is in a simple way between the two. Carbon tax results. This is British Columbia, it's only to 2014, but that's all the data I could find. And this is when they put in their carbon tax. And they saw emissions go down relative to the rest of Canada. it's very difficult to find carbon tax results because they're only on a portion of emissions in Europe and not on a large part of emissions. And in Europe, there's both carbon tax and cap and trade. In other areas, these are prices of carbon tax across the globe. Many places have carbon tax, but it's very, very low. Mexico is $1. Other places in the 20 to 50 range, and that was where British Columbia was, about $35. And then much higher range also, and that's mostly Scandinavia. And Scandinavia, interestingly, were the first to introduce any price on carbon. Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and France. France, you may remember, with the yellow vests, had huge demonstrations against the carbon tax. With that pressure, they reduced the carbon tax and it does not increase as much as they originally hoped. There's two additional elements that are important to understand cap and trade and carbon tax in, especially in California. For us in California, we hear a lot about both of these. One is called carbon leakage and one is carbon credits, also called offsets. So what is carbon leakage? Let's use an example from California. If a business in California thinks that the price that they have to pay for allowances and to reduce emissions is too high, and they can go to Mexico where the carbon tax is $1, they might go to Mexico, but they continue to emit. And so that's leakage. You're not getting CO2 reduction, it's just going out of state. And to prevent leakage, then the government allocates, which is essentially gives some allowances to vulnerable entities, and allocations decrease with time. These are the allocations that are given in California: electrical distribution, natural gas suppliers, and industrial primarily, and other. So those are the groups that receive allocations. This is the California cap reduction. You can see it decreases over time. You can also see that absolutely every element decreases over time. The orange on the bottom is what the state sells as allowances, and these two are allocations. The green up above is in case a company couldn't get enough allowances, they could buy allowances from this reserve at a higher price, but that has never been used. So the cap shows that we actually do decrease over time, and we are. The next additional element is called carbon credits or offsets. So if a factory, for example, emits 2 tons of CO2 and a forest absorbs 2 tons of CO2, if you put them together, it offsets the emission. And credits have a value, which is really important. Why credits? Credits put a value on taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what the forest does. So drawdown. And putting a value on credits puts the market to work to make the forest more valuable alive than dead. So that's really the motivation behind credits. Carbon credits are expanding. These are where they're already implemented in the reddish color and in consideration in the blue. A couple of notes. Quantification in some cases is difficult. Like the legislative interview question we have on drawdown from natural and working lands, calculating the amount of drawdown is very difficult. It depends on the crop. It depends on the level at which it is a climate smart agriculture. It depends on the season. It depends on the year, how much rainfall there is that year and so forth. So getting a scientific quantification of some of the elements that we want to give credits for is still a developing science. The other element that must be done and we're doing it, I think, very well in California, is verification or authentication. So if you say, okay, I have a forest here and I'm going to sell it, rather than cutting it down, I'm going to just I'm going to sell it to you for carbon credits, but didn't have any intention whatsoever to cut it down in the first place. So that's what we don't want to have. So verification is very important. Offsets in California are not very large. They're 8% of the compliance obligation or allowances through this year, or last year rather, and 4% for the next 4 years. And then as it becomes more difficult to reduce emissions, they go up to 6% until 2030. And at least half of the offset projects must be in the state to provide direct environmental benefits to the state. The operators who buy and sell offsets have to have an offset has to be in the offset project registry to be eligible. So, and that's where the verification authentication happens, and it is rigorous. So we've talked a lot about the two systems, cap and trade and carbon tax. So where are they different and where are they the same? Cap and trade, excuse me, sets a declining cap and ensures that emissions decrease. Carbon tax, emissions decrease depends on the price of the tax. And setting that price and knowing what that price is inexact at best. But you can set reviews to adjust the price. So you can say, okay, in 10 years, we're going to see if we're getting the emissions we planned on, and if not, we'll raise the price. So that is something that can be adjusted. They're also different in that in a cap and trade system, you can trade across a broad market. For example, California trades with Quebec. And we're looking, the Clean Power Plan was setting up a cap and trade across the US for a very broad market. Whereas in carbon tax, a single state, it's very difficult to have a single state have a carbon tax. It really needs to be a federal tax. And as we've seen, that's a challenge. But they're the same in a lot of ways. Because there's a price, innovation is encouraged. You saw company A made some changes so that it didn't have to buy as many allowances. Because there's money involved, in any case, both provide innovation. Credits can encourage carbon drawdown, and those can be offset credits or allowance credits, or they can be tax credits. So both can encourage carbon drawdown. And the allocations can prevent leakage, same way tax credits can prevent leakage. So there are a lot of similarities, but the big difference is where the government comes in and where the market comes in. Now, you might think that congressional legislation hasn't happened. There's been a lot of press about HR 763, for example, but for years, we've had carbon pricing legislation, this is in federal, of both cap and trade in green and carbon tax. Initially, it was bipartisan, the McCain-Lieberman bill. Then it went to very partisan. This was the Waxman-Markey bill year, that the only one that passed the House but defeated in the Senate. And it remained partisan through this period and has returned to bipartisan, which is very interesting. The other way that it's morphed is that whereas offsets were not considered important, every one of these bills this year, or in the last Congress, now has offsets. So it's become a realization that we need to have drawdown and we want the market to work there as well. What about the most vulnerable communities? In California, folks that don't have much money in the Bay Area, for example, low income housing is right down on the water. So West Oakland, West Berkeley, East Palo Alto, similarly in other areas. And so the most vulnerable often get hit the worst. And in cap and trade in California, we have something we call disadvantaged communities, which is defined and is shown in the map here in red. And the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is where all of the cap and trade revenues are deposited, says that at least 25% of projects have to provide a benefit to disadvantaged communities, and at least 10% have to be located in those communities. So that's California's attempt to recognize and protect the most vulnerable. So in summary, carbon pricing works. It can be complex, but it's basic economics and market signals work. Economists really totally agree. As far, I've never heard of an economist that doesn't agree that this is something that can work. It will change behavior. We've seen that not just in cap and trade, but just in general in markets. And it is the cheapest method to reduce emissions. So by far the cheapest actually, and it does get results. So like Nat Cohen of Environmental Defense Fund said, it's a rocket fueled boost to emissions reductions. A couple of key resources for more information. The Price on Carbon website, as we described, has a lot of information, including information on the League, because it is a League endorsed website. And the World Bank. The World Bank is the best resource I've found for global information. And every year they do this report, state and trends of carbon pricing. And they have a carbon pricing dashboard, so you can, it's interactive and you can see things there. So that's the presentation. It was a lot, I know, but I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Diz. That was really wonderful. I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask before we started with the participants' questions. First of all, I kind of wanted to hear what you were going to say about the China's cap and trade. Just a few words about that, please.
That's just beginning. I think 2 or 3 years ago, they started in the mega cities. So, you know, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong province, and so forth. And now they've expanded it to the entire country. And they're an authoritarian government, so it has a declining cap. And it's recent enough that we don't have results. But they are the largest emitter in the globe, and they have put in cap and trade. So they are serious about reducing emissions.
It says check disabled.
Then the other question I had was about a border adjustment tax that I've heard just recently that the European Union is going to start having a border adjustment tax starting in 2023.
Right. So, for example, if one entity, one country has a carbon tax on something, for example, Sweden has a $119 tax, and if they're importing something that is not taxed at that level from a country that has a lower price, then they adjust it upwards so that it's the same. The consumers in Sweden pay the same amount whether it's imported or made in Sweden. So the border adjustment is a way of making the market equitable and not letting money or products come in or whatever services come in with an advantage to the market, the entity's market.
So that means that if the U.S. since California has a carbon tax, then they don't have to pay extra to sell products in the EU. Is that what it means?
Well, the EU and California, usually it's adjustment within entities. So it would be EU adjust across borders. The US would adjust across state borders. And we have the same system, which is a sort of adjustment between Quebec and California, that we have the same system and we have the same market for allowances, which is the way a cap and trade does border adjustments. So it's uses the same, the market sets that difference.
Okay, thank you. Then I have another question. I was wondering if you could explain again how, if there is no price increase in cap and trade, is it still working? Because I had heard that with a pandemic, that the California's cap and trade prices went down. So if you could explain, that, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is the story that we had. First of all, the COVID, the COVID has not really affected emissions much at all. It's the tiniest little dip in the global emissions. And so people said, oh, wow, we're not traveling as much. It must make a big dent. And it really didn't, which is too bad. But in any case, and the price of emission or of allowances in California have not really dipped. They started out at about $12. They're moving steadily up and now they're about 17. But even if they were still at $12, it doesn't mean that it's not working. And that's because a company can either buy allowances or they can modify their process so that they're reducing their emissions in another way. And so if they reduce their emissions, they don't need as many allowances. So the auction price that doesn't continue up because there's not as much demand. Is that?
Yes, thank you. And I just want to let everybody know that we're asking everyone to put questions into the Q&A instead of the chat. So the chat has been disabled, so that's okay. Just go to the Q&A button, which is on the right-hand side of the bottom of your screen to ask more questions. So we have a lot of questions from Andrea. And I think one thing that has been, that she asked that a lot of people might not be wondering is cap and trade affecting, since there's still a lot of emissions increasing, even in California where there's cap and trade, how is cap and trade working?
Actually, emissions are not increasing in California. They're decreasing.
Really?
Yeah. And you can see, I don't have the plot up here, but we have the emissions. Our goal is to get down to 80% of 1990 levels by 2050 or something like that. And we're on track already for our 2020 schedule, and our power plants are on track for the 2030 schedule. So our emissions are decreasing. And in Europe, I showed you the plot. Those are actual emissions, measured emissions, and they are decreasing. As I said, in China, it just started. So it's not, they don't have enough history to see it decreasing. In fact, Nat Cohen of Environmental Defense Fund and the group there have done a lot of analysis on carbon pricing, both kinds. And every cap and trade system so far has shown emission drops. So they're working because the cap requires that they work.
Well, very good. And also a question on the process of cap and trade. And is it an expensive process to administer cap and trade in California? It's not cheap. That's right. And it takes a while to set it up. Once it's set up, it's not that different. Carbon tax, on the other hand, we already have a system set up for carbon tax. The problem with carbon tax is people reject the idea of paying a tax, and to set the price is hard. So yeah, it's non-trivial, the cost of a cap and trade system, but once it's set up, it's not relative to the revenue that is gained from the revenue of selling the allowances. It's not important. Okay, then we have a question also about is the agriculture, the idea of credits for agriculture sequestering carbon, is that part of cap and trade? Yes,
we have offsets, and we have, I think, I can't remember now, I think it's 4% of our emissions for the next 4 years can be offsets. And it can be from any form of system that captures and sequesters carbon that we can prove with science, that we can quantify. The challenge with the capturing and sequestering carbon from climate smart ag is we don't really know how much each individual plot does. We do know that in order to draw down emissions, agriculture is one of the biggest ways we can do it. But we don't have a way to quantify that for offset. So yes, it's important for drawdown. Absolutely, we need to do it. But we haven't been able to quantify it yet for the validation necessary to have it as an offset anywhere, I don't think. In California, certainly not. Forests are a lot easier to calculate. We know how many trees, we know how big the trees are, and so forth. It's much easier. But offsets need to be verified and authenticated. And as I said, it's a developing science to determine how much drawdown there is for each offset.
And could you explain again a little more about trying to decrease leakage of emitting producers going to Mexico or in other ways?
Yeah, Mexico is just an example. It can be anywhere. So leakage is if you're a company in California and you don't want to do the process that emits the most carbon because it's expensive, and you can go to Nevada where it's doesn't have a cap and trade system and build your plant there, you're going to emit the same amount of carbon, or you're going to emit the carbon. It's not reducing carbon. So we don't want companies to leak out the CO2. That's why it's called leakage. And so that's why we do allowances also to keep the companies in California, and the allocation of those that we give to them decreases over time. So the actual emissions decrease over time and the companies stay in the state.
Okay, then I have another question about why is forming a large trading market in cap and trade an advantage?
Well, for example, if in the Clean Power Plan had that you could price your carbon, and it could be a cap and trade system, and the ones that were working on the Clean Power Plan did come up with cap and trade. For example, you're Montana, and you have one producer of electricity, one large producer, which is can't remember the name right now, but anyway, and they have to, there's a tax on them, or if it's their tax will be high on that one thing, but if they could trade in a broader market, the cost of allowances would be averaged out over the entire market, and so the price would reflect all sources of carbon emission, not just their one source of carbon emission. So it's more affordable, and the emissions overall still go down. So for example, we have the carbon market with Quebec, and we're still seeing prices go down, and it makes it allowable for the companies in both places to find the cheapest way to reduce their emissions. So a broad market across the globe would be the ideal market, because then the low-hanging fruit would happen right away, and we could work on we know the cap is going down, so we could work on getting all of the emissions done with the companies taking the most effective way to do that.
Okay, well, that's a lot about cap and trade, and I have there's been several questions about the carbon fee or carbon fair tax program, especially about the dividends. And that is the tax on people, or is it who exactly is being taxed, and who would be getting the dividends?
Well, that's all in the legislation, and it can be a wide range of things. So you can tax at the pump if it's liquid petroleum fuels. You can tax at the ground where it comes out. And that depends on the legislation where you tax. And the dividend can be a dividend to all humans in the country. It can be to all citizens in the country. It can be to all social security numbers in the country. And that's, you know, has to be decided in the legislation. The league does not have our price on carbon position is that we absolutely support getting a price on carbon, whether it's carbon tax or fee or cap and trade. But we don't have a position on how the revenue is used, because that is so widely varied across different entities. For example, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has 11 states involved, and each of the states gets to decide how their revenue is used. So it actually gets it started, and then you don't have to argue about who does what with the revenue. I don't know if I answered that question. I kind of wandered off. So the dividend can be any kind of, anything you want to have it be. The CCL dividend is to all households, as I think, and it's a flat rate. So it's the same amount to everybody. And the data on that show that it would, it does protect the most vulnerable to some extent, although the flat is arguable as regressive. So, you know, it's debatable. That's why the league doesn't have a position on that.
Yeah, that's understandable. It is very complicated, and it is very complicated by both the way that you can tax and the way that you can spend the revenue. And I did not understand that before. And I think that there's a couple of people have been asking what we can do to, or what steps can be taken to get a broader support for carbon fee and dividend, or for cap and trade.
Well, CCL is doing a great job on fee and dividend in lobbying, and they are a wonderful organization that have worked to build bipartisan support in Congress. And it's the constituencies that have to be changed, and that's what we're working on in the National Carbon Pricing team, is to build support among constituencies. So it's really education. One of the things that's been a drawback, I think, on the CCL guys and the carbon tax people is they think that's the only way, whereas actually the cap and trade works really well. And I think there's a dearth of understanding of carbon cap and trade systems, thinking that businesses will cheat the system and make more money and so forth and so on, but it's really regulated. And so I don't see that as a problem. Also, they're having a hard time selling the idea of a tax, witness France. But where it's actually implemented, it's like so many other things that there's the naysayers say, oh, it'll crater the economy. And we know, of course, in California, that doesn't happen. So it's really building an understanding, talking about the facts, not the fear, and actually getting the facts. So we don't say things that aren't actually true. In the urgency to get something, make sure that we understand all sides of the issue.
Yeah, excuse me, there's a question about which is more effective, cap or trade or carbon tax.
Well, cap and trade has worked everywhere it's used, and we don't have enough information on carbon tax, really. It worked in British Columbia. The carbon tax in Mexico is $1. Obviously, it's not going to work. Carbon tax is not on all emissions. In the California-Quebec system is on 85% of emissions. So that's most of the economy. Most of the carbon taxes are only on some part of emissions. Some of the cap and trade is only on some part of emissions also, like RGGI is only on power plants. But in terms of what has worked, it's hard to find data on carbon tax, as I said, because it's only on part of emissions, it's not on the whole system. And in Europe, there's, like I said, in Scandinavia, there's some high prices, including France, but they're also part of the European Union cap and trade emissions trading system. So that's cap and trade. So, you know, it's hard to separate it out.
So, and there's another question about, I mean, I think the difference, difference with carbon tax legislations, especially federal carbon tax legislation, that would be, you know, throughout the whole country. And so you would be getting a countrywide effort that you would hope would be more. And is there, and that is with the bills that are in Congress and the bills that are going to be introduced in Congress, in this new Congress. And I have a question about, is there any idea of getting cap and trade policy implemented nationally?
All of the green bars are bills of cap and trade implemented nationally. So yeah, in the last one, we had one bill is all, and two and two and two. But yeah, they're all looking at cap and trade as a national system. Nothing has got, except for the two bills that I mentioned, nothing has gotten out of committee. So it's a hard sell. And let me repeat that now all of the bills have offsets, all of them, including all of the carbon tax bills. So yeah, there are plans to do it. The biggest one was the Clean Power Plan, but it was trounced by the Trump administration.
And then there's questions on cap and trade is focused on business. Isn't it time to include for every person with saving our planet? So cap and
that's a false statement. It's not focused on business. It's 85% of the entire economy in California, and that's not only business. So if you buy gasoline, it's part of the cap and trade system. Electricity, of course, is part of the cap and trade system. 85% of the economy. It's not just business.
Okay. And then there was a question about that the EPA is reevaluating cap and trade in California to be sure it's meeting their goals. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything. I don't know anything about that. And the EPA is kind of an interesting dynamic right now. So let's watch that for a while and see what happens. I don't know about that.
And then we have questions about national cap and trade, and there's one in Tibet, and there's one question about India. Can you address those at all?
Well, we have the map of where cap and trade is. Tibet and India don't have existing systems that are national. I don't know. What could you expand the question a little bit more?
I think they were just wondering, is India or Tibet involved in cap and trade?
No.
And would they deal with California in that way?
Well, California would love to deal with everybody. We've been trying. And if Washington and Oregon both want to establish a cap and, well, in the Western, whatever it's called, Western Climate Initiative, I can't remember what it's called. We have an agreement with Washington and Oregon that we would like to build a market across. But as you remember, Oregon has had kind of a soap opera version of trying to get cap and trade passed. And now they're sort of giving up for this legislature, but it won't go away. And India is a huge emitter, and there's no plans that I know of building a carbon pricing system, but I haven't kept up with India.
Okay, so the very last question we're going to talk about is what agencies monitor the requirements for the disadvantaged communities? And personally, do you feel it has worked in California?
Do. It's California Air Resources Board monitors all of the cap and trade system, is who monitors it. And there's a bunch of different parts to that, like the offset inventory and so forth. We had an interesting league presentation in West Oakland, which is, and there was a presentation that said that they wanted to change to something that was more direct to disadvantaged communities, and the disadvantaged community so-called representatives jumped up and said, no, we get great support from cap and trade. So that's just an anecdotal system argument. The numbers show that there's a lot that's going to disadvantaged communities. West Oakland is not necessarily, I think it is categorized as a disadvantaged community, but I'm not positive on that. So, you know, we have to watch that because climate justice is important. A single, you know, if we just raise the price on everything, that's hurts the most vulnerable more, because that more of their income needs to go to energy because they don't have as much income. So we need to watch that very carefully. And we have a climate justice team on the US climate team that is working on that specifically. And we'll look at California's disadvantaged community, see if it's actually working. The idea is that it is based on the areas down by Riverside and so on are saying that it seems to be working, but I don't know.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
thank you. This has been very informative, and I'm very thankful for you coming and giving us this information. And thank you all for your questions, and I hope we answered them. There were a lot of questions, and it's a very complex issue and a complex way of addressing things. And so some of the answers weren't so straightforward because that's the way that the system, you know, that we have right now. So thank you all. And now over to Anne to finish.
Thank you everyone for coming. This program is being taped and will be available on our website by Monday afternoon. The website address is LWVNC as in county SD.org. And I think we all learned a lot today. Thank you very much, Diz. And thank you, Carol, for putting this together. Very informative. I've learned a lot. And I need to join that group. There's a portion there I really want to work on. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Nancy, for being our Zoom master today. Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Stay safe.